Something happened on The Tonight Show that NBC tried to bury for 40 years. The studio lights at NBC Burbank burned hot that October night in 1976, but not as hot as the tension building behind Studio One's soundstage doors. Johnny Carson sat at his desk, shuffling index cards he wouldn't need. He'd done this for 14 years. He knew how to read a room. And tonight, the room felt wrong. Frank Sinatra was scheduled. That alone meant security had doubled. Sinatra appearances always did, but this was different. Word had traveled through the crew since 4 that afternoon, whispered in hallways, exchanged between cameramen during lighting checks. Something had happened, something involving a name you didn't say out loud in certain circles. Johnny's producer, Fred de Cordova, had pulled him aside at an hour before taping. "Frank's still coming," Fred said, which meant Johnny had asked the question without asking it. "But there's been a situation." Johnny didn't press. You didn't press with Sinatra. You learned that early, or you didn't last. The audience filed in at 6:30, dressed in their best, cameras prohibited, excited for the taping that would air at 11:30. They didn't know what they were about to witness. Neither did Johnny. Not really. Frank arrived at 6:45, earlier than expected. He came through the back entrance, the one that bypassed the main corridor, flanked by 2 men Johnny recognized but had never been introduced to. Sinatra wore a charcoal suit, perfectly tailored, a pale blue shirt open at the collar. No tie. That was deliberate. Everything with Frank was deliberate. He didn't stop by Johnny's dressing room. That was unusual. Sinatra always stopped by, even if just for 30 seconds. A handshake, a joke about the Dodgers or the president. It was ritual. Tonight, the ritual broke. Backstage, crew members moved with unusual precision. No one lingered. No one made eye contact with Sinatra's dressing room door. The makeup woman, Carol, who'd worked Sinatra appearances since 1968, came out of his room pale. Someone asked if she was all right. She nodded, said nothing, and walked to the employee lounge, where she stayed until after the taping. Johnny stood in the hallway 20 minutes before showtime, pretending to review his notes. He was really watching Sinatra's door. It stayed closed. No sounds came from inside. That silence felt heavier than noise. At 7:10, Fred approached Johnny again. This time, his voice was lower. "He wants to go on first segment, before Doc and Ed." That never happened. The format was sacred. Monologue, banter with Ed McMahon and Doc Severinsen, then the first guest. "You didn't rearrange the architecture of The Tonight Show." "Not for anyone." "Did he say why?" Johnny asked. Fred shook his head, but his eyes said he knew. He just wasn't saying. Johnny nodded. "Make it happen." At 7:25, with 5 minutes until taping, Sinatra's door opened. He stepped into the hallway alone. The 2 men who'd arrived with him stayed inside. Frank walked toward the stage entrance, hands in his pockets, moving with that particular stillness he had, not rushed, not slow, just absolute. He passed Johnny without stopping, but as he did, he said one thing: "Thanks for this." Johnny felt the weight in those 3 words. He'd heard Sinatra thank people before. This wasn't gratitude. This was acknowledgement of something larger, something Johnny was now part of, whether he wanted to be or not. The floor director gave the signal. Doc Severinsen's band launched into the Tonight Show theme. The audience applauded, conditioned by years of ritual. Johnny walked through the curtain, smiled, waved, sat at his desk. He delivered the monologue. Jokes about Carter, about inflation, about a fire in Los Angeles that had closed 2 freeways. The audience laughed in the right places. Johnny barely heard them. Ed McMahon laughed his trademark laugh, loud and familiar. Doc made a comment about the band's new arrangement. Everything appeared normal. But Johnny kept glancing at the curtain where Sinatra would enter. And crew members who'd worked the show for years could see something in Johnny's posture, a tightness in his shoulders, a different quality to his smile. "Our first guest tonight," Johnny said, and the audience began applauding before he finished the sentence, because they could see the cue card, and they knew who was coming. "Is a man who needs no introduction, but I'll give him one anyway because that's what they pay me for." Laughter. Comfortable. Safe. He's sold more records than I've told bad jokes, and that's saying something. He's acted in more films than most of us have seen, and he's been on this show enough times that he knows where the bathroom is better than I do. More laughter. Johnny was stretching it out, giving Frank time, giving himself time. Please welcome Frank Sinatra. The applause was immediate, thunderous. The Tonight Show audience always brought energy for Sinatra, but tonight it felt different. Louder, almost defensive, as if the audience sensed they were supposed to applaud harder than usual. Frank came through the curtain. He didn't wave. He walked straight to Johnny's desk, shook his hand, firm, brief, and sat in the guest chair. No smile, no acknowledgement of the crowd. He adjusted his jacket, crossed his legs, and waited. The applause faded. An unusual silence settled over Studio One. Audiences filled those gaps instinctively with whoops, whistles, settling sounds. Tonight, they went quiet. Johnny leaned back in his chair, a posture that usually signaled casual conversation ahead, but his hands gripped the armrest just slightly. "Frank, good to see you." "Good to be here, Johnny." The exchange felt rehearsed, even though it wasn't. Two professionals navigating a moment neither had prepared for. Johnny glanced at his note cards, a gesture that bought him 3 seconds. When he looked up, Frank was watching him with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't friendly either. It was expectant. "There's been some talk today," Johnny said, and the audience leaned forward collectively, sensing the shift in tone. "Some things said by some people, and I'm told you'd like to address it." That was direct for Carson. He rarely opened with confrontation. But Frank had changed the format, changed the segment order, and now Johnny was changing his approach. Sinatra didn't react immediately. He let the silence sit. 5 seconds. 10. The cameras stayed on him. No cutaway to Johnny, no audience shot. Just Frank, sitting in the guest chair, jaw set, eyes clear. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. The audience in the back rows strained to hear. "Yeah, there's been some talk," Frank said. "There's always talk. Most of it I ignore because most of it's garbage said by garbage people looking to sell newspapers or make themselves feel important." He paused. Johnny didn't interrupt. "But today, someone said something about my mother." The temperature in the studio dropped. You could feel it, a physical change in the air. Audience members who'd been smiling stopped. Crew members froze. Camera operators kept filming, but their bodies tensed. Johnny's face didn't change, but his hands released the armrests. Frank continued. "A man named Anthony Provenzano, Tony Pro, they call him, was interviewed this morning. He's currently awaiting trial, federal charges, the kind that mean he's looking at serious time. And when a man's in that position, he says things. He makes noise. He tries to remind people he's still relevant." Sinatra's voice stayed level, almost conversational, but underneath was something else, something cold. "Tony Pro told a reporter that my career was built on mob connections, that my mother was involved with organized crime in Hoboken, that I wouldn't be sitting here tonight if it wasn't for men like him, pulling strings 30 years ago." Johnny shifted in his seat. This was live television. This was going out to 12 million homes. NBC executives were likely on phones right now, screaming at each other, trying to decide if they should cut the feed. They didn't cut it. "Now," Frank said, uncrossing his legs and leaning forward slightly, "I've heard this garbage before. Different names, same story. It's been following me since 1947, and most of the time I let it go because addressing it just gives it oxygen. But when you bring up my mother, when you say Dolly Sinatra's name in the same sentence as criminals and corruption, you cross the line." His voice didn't rise. That was what made it powerful. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't performing outrage. He was stating facts with the kind of controlled fury that suggested he'd thought about this for hours, maybe longer. Johnny, to his credit, didn't try to lighten the mood. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't deflect. He simply asked, "What do you want people to know?" That question, direct, simple, gave Sinatra the platform, and everyone watching understood that Johnny was stepping aside deliberately. Frank looked directly into camera 2. Not at Johnny, not at the audience, at the lens. "My mother was a midwife. She helped deliver babies in Hoboken when most women couldn't afford hospitals. She ran a tavern during Prohibition because that's how you survived in that neighborhood in those years. She knew everyone. Democrats, Republicans, workers, businessmen. Yes, she probably knew some men who were connected. Everyone did. That's how neighborhoods worked." He paused, and in that pause you could hear the faint hum of the studio lights. But she was not a criminal. She was not involved in organized crime. She was a woman who fought for her family, who worked herself half to death so her son could have singing lessons, who believed in me when no one else did. And any man who uses her name to score points while he's sitting in a cell waiting to be sentenced is a coward. The word coward landed like a stone in still water. Johnny's desk was positioned so viewers at home could see both men in profile. In that moment, you could see Johnny's expression, something between respect and concern. He knew this was history happening. He also knew this was dangerous. Tony Pro, Frank continued, is not a mob boss. He's a union official currently indicted on multiple charges including embezzlement and conspiracy. The newspapers call him a mob boss because it sells papers. But let's be clear about what he is. A man who stole from working people, who intimidated honest workers, and who is now trying to drag down anyone with a bigger name than his, so people remember him when he's sentenced. Sinatra sat back, the intensity in his posture easing slightly, but not disappearing. I've been investigated by the FBI more times than I can count, Senate subcommittees, state commissions. Every few years, someone hauls me in or asks for testimony because they're sure, absolutely certain, that I'm connected to organized crime. And every time they find nothing, because there's nothing to find. Johnny finally spoke. You've never been charged with anything. Never, Frank confirmed. Not once. But the accusations keep coming because people love a story more than they love the truth. The audience was silent. No applause. No reaction. They were listening, really listening, in a way that rarely happened during late-night television. Here's what people don't understand, Sinatra said, his voice softening just slightly. When you grow up where I grew up, when you came from the neighborhoods I came from, you were surrounded by all kinds of people. Some were good, some were bad, some were in between. And if you made it out, if you became successful, people assumed it was because the bad ones helped you. He looked at Johnny now instead of the camera. I made it out because I could sing, because I worked harder than anyone else, because I took every job, every opportunity, every chance I got. And yeah, I knew some tough guys. Everyone did. But knowing someone and being owned by them are two different things. Johnny nodded slowly. So when Tony Pro says what he said this morning, he's lying, Frank interrupted, the word sharp and final. He's lying to make himself feel bigger than he is, and he's using my mother's name to do it, which means he's not just a liar, he's a disrespectful liar. The way Frank said disrespectful carried weight that went beyond definition. It was a word with consequences attached. Johnny glanced toward Fred de Cordova, who stood just off camera. Fred gave the smallest nod. Keep going. What do you want to happen now? Johnny asked. It was a dangerous question. It invited Sinatra to make a threat on national television. But Johnny had asked it, and now they were both committed to wherever this was heading. Frank smiled for the first time since sitting down. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd already made his decision and was now simply explaining it to others. I want Tony Pro to know that I heard what he said. I want him to know that when you say things about people, especially people who can't defend themselves anymore because they've passed, you don't get to walk away clean. There are consequences. Consequences, Johnny repeated, his tone neutral. Not the kind you're thinking, Frank said, reading the room. I'm not threatening the man. I'm saying that his words have consequences. He wanted attention. He got it. Now everyone knows what kind of man he is. Everyone knows he'll say anything, lie about anyone, to try to stay relevant. Sinatra leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. And I want people watching tonight to understand something. When you see headlines tomorrow, and there will be headlines, they're going to say Sinatra blasts mob boss, or Sinatra responds to accusations. They're going to make it sound like a fight between equals. It's not. It's a successful entertainer correcting lies told by a desperate criminal. That's all this is. The simplicity of that statement was devastating. Johnny let the moment breathe. The camera held on both men. No cutaway, no music cue, just silence. Finally, Johnny said, "Your mother passed away earlier this year." January, Frank confirmed. Plane crash. The audience knew this. It had been major news. Dolly Sinatra, Frank's mother, had died when the private plane she was traveling in crashed into a mountain in California. She was 82. She was something, Johnny said, and it wasn't a question. She was everything. Frank replied, and for the first time his voice carried emotion that wasn't anger. Tougher than any man I ever met, smarter than most. And she didn't take garbage from anyone, which is probably where I got it from. A few people in the audience laughed softly, a release of tension. So when Tony Pro or anyone else tries to use her name to make themselves look important, Frank continued, they don't understand who they're talking about, and they definitely don't understand who they're disrespecting. Johnny nodded. He understood the message being sent. So did everyone watching. I appreciate you coming here tonight to set the record straight, Johnny said, and the formal phrasing signaled a transition. But Frank wasn't done. One more thing, he said, holding up a hand. Tony Pro's trial starts in 3 weeks, federal court, Newark. The charges against him include misappropriating union pension funds, money that belonged to truckers, dock workers, regular people trying to retire with dignity. So while he's sitting there, trying to bring up my name to distract from what he did, I hope the jury remembers what he actually did. Not what he claims I did, but what he's on trial for. It was a tactical move, reminding the public and potentially jurors what Provenzano was actually accused of. Whether it would impact the trial was debatable, but it would definitely impact public perception. Johnny glanced at his cards again, then pushed them aside. We're going to take a commercial break. When we come back, Doc has a story about losing his wallet in Las Vegas that Frank might appreciate. The audience applauded, relief more than enthusiasm. The tension broke just enough. Don't go anywhere, Johnny said to the camera. The red light went off. Commercial break. What happened in the next 90 seconds wasn't broadcast, but 12 crew members witnessed it. Frank remained seated. Johnny didn't stand. The two men sat there, the desk between them, and Frank said quietly, I meant what I said, all of it. Johnny nodded. I know. You took a risk letting me say it. It was the right thing to do, Johnny replied. Frank looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them that wasn't friendship exactly, but was respect of the deepest kind. Thank you, Frank said. Then the floor director counted down from 10. The red light came back on, and they spent the next segment telling a story about Doc Severinsen losing $300 at a craps table and trying to explain it to his wife. The audience laughed. The tone shifted. The show continued. But what had happened in those first 8 minutes didn't disappear. It couldn't. When the taping ended at 8:40, Frank left immediately. He shook Johnny's hand, nodded to Ed and Doc, and walked off stage with the same 2 men who'd arrived with him. He didn't stop to talk to crew. He didn't linger. He was gone by 8:50. NBC executives made calls throughout the night. There were discussions about editing the segment, removing portions, adding disclaimers. In the end, they aired it exactly as taped, partly because editing it would draw more attention, partly because cutting Sinatra on your own show was a fight no one wanted. The episode aired at 11:30 that night, October 14, 1976. By midnight, phone lines at NBC lit up. Some callers were outraged, some were supportive, most were simply stunned. By morning, every major newspaper had it on the front page. Sinatra blasts Provenzano on Carson. Singer defends late mother against mob claims. Sinatra's on-air confrontation. Anthony Provenzano's lawyers issued a statement calling Sinatra's comments defamatory and prejudicial to the upcoming trial. They filed a motion requesting a change of venue, arguing that Sinatra's appearance had poisoned the jury pool. The motion was denied. 3 weeks later, Provenzano was convicted on multiple counts. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. During sentencing, the judge made no mention of Sinatra or the Tonight Show appearance. But court observers noted that the prosecution had referenced Provenzano's attempts to deflect blame and attention through public accusations in their closing arguments. Tony Pro served most of his sentence. He died in prison in 1988. Frank Sinatra never mentioned him again publicly, but people who worked at NBC during that era, crew members who were there that night, all said the same thing years later. They'd never seen anything like it. Not the content of what Sinatra said, though that was remarkable, but the way he said it. The control, the precision, the absolute certainty that he was right, and everyone else would eventually understand why. Johnny Carson rarely talked about specific episodes in interviews. The Tonight Show produced thousands of hours of content over 3 decades, most blurred together. But in a 1989 interview with Tom Shales, a year before Johnny retired, Shales asked if there were any episodes that stood out as unique. Johnny thought for a moment, then said, "The night Frank came on to respond to Tony Provenzano. That was television you couldn't script." "Because of what he said?" Shales asked. "Because of what he didn't say," Johnny replied. "Frank could have gone a lot further. He could have made threats. He could have named names. He could have turned it into something ugly. Instead, he made it about his mother, about honor, about the truth, and he did it in a way that left no room for argument." "Did you ever talk to him about it afterward?" Johnny shook his head. "Didn't need to. We understood each other." That was as much as Johnny ever said publicly. But Fred de Cordova, in his memoir published in 1995, included a passage about that night. Frank arrived with a purpose. He'd been planning what he was going to say all day, maybe longer. He didn't ask permission. He didn't negotiate. He simply told us he needed to go on first, and we made it happen because you didn't say no to Sinatra, but also because we knew, Johnny knew, that something important was happening, something that needed to be said, and our job was to get out of the way and let it happen. The tape of that episode became one of the most requested in NBC's archives. Journalism professors used it in media ethics classes. It appeared in documentaries about Sinatra, about The Tonight Show, about the intersection of entertainment and organized crime in American culture. But the people who were actually there, the crew, the audience members, the musicians, they remembered something else. They remembered the silence in the studio when Frank said the word coward. They remembered the way Johnny Carson, who'd interviewed presidents and comedians and actors and musicians for 14 years, sat back and let Sinatra speak without interruption. They remembered that for 8 minutes, live television stopped being entertainment and became something else. A reckoning, a defense, a line drawn that no one would cross again. And they remembered that when it was over, when the show moved on to lighter topics and Doc's story about Las Vegas, Frank Sinatra had already left the building. He'd said what he came to say, and everyone who heard it knew, without question, without doubt, that he'd meant every word.